Hello and welcome to A to Gen Z. This is our three-part webinar series with Concordia Publishing House talking all about Gen Z. So that's ages 10 through 25. We've had a really great lineup discussing all sorts of stuff about them. And today we have another brilliant panel that's joining us. So I'm going to let them jump in and introduce themselves because we have a lot of great stuff to cover today. So let's go for it. Are you guys ready? Let's do this. All right, Jon, tell us who you are.
Hey everybody, I'm Jon Zellar, DCE. I do youth and young adult ministries, so 7th grade through whatever you think young adult finishes. I'm in Edina, Minnesota, which is a suburb of the Twin Cities, and excited to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Shelly Schwalm, and I am on the other side of the river in the Twin Cities from where Jon is. I'm at Concordia University in St. Paul, and I am a director of Christian education serving in campus ministry.
Hi everybody, my name is Eric Dunn. I'm the Director of Christian Education at Trinity Lutheran Ministries in Edwardsville, Illinois. Edwardsville is just across the river from St. Louis, so in the metro area there. I do 6th through 12th grade youth group stuff, and then I also do some work with our older adult ministry and our small groups.
Awesome. My name is Hopf. I'm a student ministry pastor down here in Spring, Texas, which is just on the outskirts of Houston. So that means I get the joy of working with 7th to 12th grade students primarily, while also getting the joy of working just across the board at different things here at Trinity.
Hey, I'm Matt Popovits, senior pastor at St. Mark Houston in Houston, Texas, and also the founder of MPM, an organization that exists to creatively communicate the gospel and help others do the same.
All right, and I am Cassie Moore. I'm your host. I'm an author and director of Next Gen Ministries, also at St. Mark Houston. So Matt and I are actually right down the hall from each other right now, but happy to be here. So we are going to dive in. We've got a lot of great stuff to cover today. So talking all about Gen Z, we have heard a lot from them. If you missed the last couple of panels, they were excellent. You can check that out at cph.org/Gen Z. We have 2 different webinars up there right now. But today we are talking about Gen Z and the church and how do we reach them? A disengaged culture. What do we do with that? So first question, what's one thing that you appreciate about Gen Z, but then one thing that makes it really challenging to reach them?
So I would say the biggest thing I really appreciate about Gen Z as I've gotten to work with in the last 5 years or so is they're all about the fun. They're there for the party. They are very communal, very relatable. They love that opportunity to relate to one another and really as much as the anxiety gets them at times, they're really there to just be in the moment a lot of the time too. And so when you can catch them in that moment, like that's some of my favorite times with them. Challenge wise, I think there's just so many voices that they hear, whether that's voices of parents, teachers, coaches. We heard that in one of the first webinars, that it's hard to walk with them as they try and let Jesus be one of those voices, and really to listen and focus in on that one in particular. So I guess those are my appreciation and my challenge for you.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I really love about Gen Z is that they're truth seekers. And I think that is in their favor and works against them from time to time. They want to know what the truth is, and sometimes they jump to things and say, yes, this is true, but didn't do the research, and then have to kind of backpedal a little bit because they're just so excited about finding the truth and being on the right side of truth. And we saw that a lot through politics, through COVID, and all the different kind of situational things. And one of the things I hope we'll get to a little bit later is how that impacts their faith walk too, and finding the truth about their faith.
Yeah, what I would add is the things that I appreciate is that they are incredibly compassionate. The young people that fall into Gen Z that I've worked with, really also connected to their emotional reality. Like they know what they're feeling, which I think is ultimately a really healthy thing. The thing that's difficult is that there is what I'm finding a real struggle to commit. Being committed to things, being tied down to things is something that they're wary of, and that they struggle with. And so I think that's part of it's playing into some of the disengagement that we see right now with young people in particular.
I agree with what everyone said so far, and I'll just add, I think they're very passionate. They're a very passionate group of people. And I think that's a double-edged sword for them. I think it's a good thing and also a hard thing for us in the church trying to reach out to them, because if you can get them passionately behind what you're doing, they're hard to stop. But if you can't get them to see the good in what you're doing, that can also be a difficulty because they're so involved with so many other things. Trying to get yourself into their schedule can be a challenge from time to time.
I'll round it out and say, I think that the Gen Z folks, they just care so deeply about people and where people are coming from, their experiences, learning about people whose experiences might not be theirs. But then also it seems like a less of a willingness to have that viewpoint of theirs challenged sometimes of, oh, I don't necessarily want to read this or hear this because it might push me or I might disagree with it. So having some of those conversations that are really rooted in relationship, yeah, it can be challenging.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much that we have to consider when we think about trying to reach this generation, trying to be there for them, because everybody here cares about them. But how do we balance all of these things and still try to reach them? So I know that's been a big topic that we have discussed a lot internally, is just we have a fairly disengaged generation right now coming out of everything we've experienced in the last year and a half with COVID. What do you guys think? Where's this disengagement coming from? Is it just, are people overscheduled? Are they tired? Is it part of their wiring already? They're disengaged. Where do you guys think this is coming from?
I feel like there's a mix, right? I mean, because their disengagement is, I mean, to some extent, I would say we might feel like they're disengaged on the church end, and we can certainly talk about some of those things, but they're still engaged with each other. Like even in the pandemic, they found ways to engage with each other. So it's really just that, going back to what Matt said about the commitment, right? And they're committed to their friendships. They're committed to certain things that they're doing because they're trying to find that community all the time. And so like, I think there's a level of that contributing to it. But I know I got to comment, I think last time on the Facebook chat, of an observation that I recently had with our students here, because we had held what we called class reunions for our high school students, just to try and bring them back together. We were doing it off campus. There wasn't that pressure of whatever came to mind when they stepped on a church campus. And I kind of asked them, I said, one of the things I had observed was kind of the loss of the leader in Gen Z. So the classes that I started with were very strong, heavy leaders. But there wasn't as many, at least in our context, with the classes that we currently have in high school. And I said, what are y'all seeing? Is that true? And they said, no, I totally see it. And they said, if there was any leader that we had, it's the crowd. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because it's kind of true for the social media side too. Whatever social media is saying to do or to follow, we're going to do that. And that's cool when we follow it. But the same is true when it comes to this engagement. What are they going to engage with? They're going to engage with what everybody's doing. And they're going to engage with people that they can. Because I think we heard that again in that first webinar of, I'm going to go where people are and where I know I fit, and I'm going to do everything I can to stay there and engage with that. We might not see that. And I think it was true for me even 5 years ago. As I started, I didn't see it, but it was happening too. And I don't know if anybody else is seeing similar things in their context.
And I think, Lee, you bring up a good point that ministry 5 years ago is different than ministry is right now. It doesn't mean that timeless truth has changed. You know, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever, but the way that we have connected with people certainly has changed.
And I think to add on to that a little bit, you know, the things and the engagement where we do see our kids is things that they value tremendously, whether it's their athletics, their grades, their, you know, insert whatever it is, right? Because I know I've had conversations with youth and parents alike that said, oh, well, they have so much homework tonight, and they're very focused on getting good grades, or they're very focused on basketball tryouts this weekend, or whatever. And so I think some of the disengagement has come from a shift in mentality to, you know, over the last 50 plus years of the church was where value was given and they could take that out. And now I don't know that that's truly the case. Although we may feel that, you know, we have this message, we have this value that we can add and give to all of these Gen Z kids and, you know, the church at large. But I just think we're not seeing the value that's placed on the church necessarily. And so we're trying to reclaim the value that the church has to kind of earn a spot back on the calendar of everybody's busy lives, and asking, how do we do that? Because it has to become the trend. It has to become the crowd think, the group focus, in order to get some momentum and some of those things, at least currently coming out of a pandemic and those sorts of things.
I think another important thing is, and this is something I've been wrestling with, as I've had conversations with you, Cassie, or you, John, maybe we have to look at what our definition of engagement is. I've been in ministry 15 years now, and it definitely looks different 15 years ago than it does now. Because when I first came out, it was like, oh, you throw these big events and everyone comes to the church, and that's the definition of engaged and a good ministry. And now I find a lot more of my ministry happens via text message, or for a while I did a Snapchat a day where I just snapped my kids a Bible verse, and I had a lot of engagement that way, but that's not engagement that like the church at large can see. So I think sometimes we fall into this trap of saying, well, the kids aren't engaged, or the church will say it. And they really are, they're just engaged in different ways. So as we talk about engagement, I think it's important to understand that maybe the definition of what engagement is might be changing along with the society at large.
Yeah, just to expand on Eric's point, I think it's spot on. The definition of what it means to be engaged has already changed in the minds of students, in the minds of Gen Z. I think part of the time there's certainly a gap between what we as church leaders see as an engaged student and what the student sees, but also there's a gap between what the parent sees as them being engaged in church. And so part of it is, if we come to an understanding that, look, being engaged in today's day and age looks very different. Like, virtual relationships are relationships. Virtual engagement is engagement for someone who's in Gen Z. We have to come to terms with that, but then we also then have to help their parents come to terms with that. If they're saying, look, why aren't their kids gathering, 2 nights a week at the church and doing this? Why isn't my son or daughter engaged in this and this and this? And so we have to come to terms with it personally as leaders, but also then help their parents understand, look, I'm actually doing ministry with your student that perhaps you don't yet value, because engagement looks different today.
Well, I think go ahead, Shelly.
Oh, I was just gonna tag onto that too, of we're so used to having content on demand, right? Whether that's Netflix but even our faith, right? Like any church that you can hop on and find a sermon on YouTube. So I don't necessarily have to, it's just a different sort of approach to saying, oh, I can do on demand sermon or Bible study or whatever. So seeing some of those pieces too, well, if my in-person event or worship experience or whatever isn't going to compete, if that's the right word, with whatever curated, amazing on-demand experience there is, redefining what engagement means. And I think for me, honestly, it's really been an exercise in humility to say, okay, who are the few that I can individually reach out to say, hey, I think you would love this thing, or can we go for a walk? Or especially with some of our being on a college campus, some of our new students who have had a couple of wonky years, you're not showing up naturally to chapel or to this event or that event, but I know you're here. So just, can I send you an email and say, hey, can we get a coffee? Or have you thought about going to this thing? I'll see you there. But it's difficult to kind of recalibrate to say, I'm used to having one email hit 50 people, or one text that's going to bring the masses. And it's just kind of recalibrating to say, well, I mean, Jesus hung out with 12 and 3. And so I think we're going to be okay with how that might look.
And I think it gets harder when you don't necessarily have the parental influence when the kids are in college, or when the kids are kids. I shouldn't say kids so lightly, I guess. When the Gen Z is out of college and in the workforce, because we don't necessarily have that direct parental influence. So it definitely becomes so much more individualized, and hey, can we meet for coffee? Or hey, can we have a small group meeting and do those sorts of things, because that's where the impact and the influence can come in terms of the re-engagement, and even more so knowing their strengths, knowing their gifts, knowing their talents, to be able to say, hey, I know you really love, children's ministry. I really need a Sunday school teacher. Would you be willing to step in and teach? Or I really could use some help at youth group on Sunday nights. Would you be willing to come hang out with high school kids? Or, being able to know their strengths, talents, and abilities to plug them in. Because if they're a part of the meaning making, they're going to be all for it. They're going to be that passionate and active Gen Z that we know and love, just behind the church.
Loving the conversation we have, especially about redefining engagement, because I think that Generation Z has redefined it for us. So like Eric, you mentioned Snapchat. I remember one of my first junior high mission trips down into the city, and they were talking about Snapchat. All about Snapchat, all these middle schoolers. And there's a thing called a Snap score. And anybody that doesn't know what it is, basically the higher the score, the more you use Snapchat. Now mine, I'd had Snapchat for like 6 years at that point, and my score was under 10,000. Okay. One of my 8th grade boys, score was over 300,000 at that point. So like they know how to engage in different ways. And so they don't see, like when they're looking at their phones, I think, Matt, you talked about that is real community. Digital experiences are real community. I learned that too. My little brother, he's 4 years younger than me, so late 20s. And he's a streamer. And I know that my parents were like very hard on him about like, what are you doing? Why are you hanging out so much down there? Both when he was a kid on just the video games, but then especially doing the streaming thing. Well, like last October, a year ago, I got to sit down. I was his first guest on his stream, and I got to meet his friends, and I was about to do air quotes, but I shouldn't do that because they're actual friends. That he doesn't call them by their first given names, calls them by their screen names, but it was very much a very real community. And I felt brought into that community just the 2 or 3 nights that I was able to sit on there with him and play these games and talk to these people. And I totally saw it. And I think the same thing is true for our kids. Like it's not what we're used to. These things got introduced into our lives. These are things that have been in place for these kids their entire lives now. And so it's that walking of the roads. I think our senior pastor in 2018, we were kind of talking about the move toward being a church that engages digitally. It was a really hard conversation for us to have. We're a church over 150 years old. And to talk about that need was just born. And then a year later, we're all going, oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. We do need to be able to engage that way. And he used that illustration of the roads, like when they were talking about Rome and all the roads that connect it. You build the roads that people are already walking. And that like always just landed on me, especially as we look at this generation. That's how they're talking. Now, I do think the other side of the coin is, and this is something that we've had to do. I seriously, I get the 8th graders all 4th quarter in our school. And so all of them in the gym, and I get to lead them. And we had to lead a couple of days of how to have a conversation in person because they don't know how to. So like, even when it came to how to compliment someone, and you tell 2 boys compliment each other, and they like both look at each other, and the only compliment across the room they could come up with is, I like your shoes, because like that was the limitation of how to compliment somebody. So I think there's stuff we can both learn from each other. Like we can certainly learn the value of a digital relationship, what that means. And then they can learn from us that, and I think they do enjoy it. I've seen this at least in the recent years of graduates. So maybe they're closer to my generation than to the Gen Z generation, but they do like, and they value being able to put the phone down and connect face to face too. So it's just walking alongside of them. I think that's going to help us.
Yeah, it's a balance, right? I've taken mission trips for years and not allowed cell phones at all. And it's funny, at first the students protested, back when I first started doing ministry, 13 years ago, it was the students like, no, I have to bring my phone. But now it's the parents who protest. The students are very willing to just hand over their phone and not worry about it for a couple of days. That's refreshing to them. So all great stuff. Here's the $1 million question. How do we engage Gen Z? What can we do to really break through all of the noise, all of the distractions? What do we do to break through and really engage them in a meaningful way?
I heard a couple of people touch on it, and I won't talk too long. I just felt like I talked forever the last one, but the one-on-one relationship. I mean, that's everything. Someone that knows their name, someone that values their story, allows them a place to listen and hear their story. Jon was talking about knowing their talents, knowing their gifts. That is everything. Somebody knows me. Somebody cares about me. Somebody misses me when they don't see my face. someone's thinking about me enough to text me encouragement during the middle of the day. That one-on-one, like the day of the everybody, I'm going to say this and everybody's going to come, it's gone. Like, it's not there anymore, even for our adults, but that individual connection is everything.
Yeah, I sat down and had lunch with a parent last week, and he looked me straight in the face because he's got a couple of athletes as his oldest kids who are tremendous athletes. And he said, not to put the pressure on you, but you are the connection for my kids to the youth group, to the youth programming, and to the church. And I think that speaks directly to the age that we're in. It's the one-on-one connections. It's the impact that church leaders are having, which is not necessarily how we've been trained, but how we're having to adjust and adapt. Because it's not the grand, mass text, hey, everybody, we're meeting for pizza at 6:30 over a pizza ranch anymore, right? It's the one-on-one, let's grab coffee, let's talk about life. It's how do we build those safe, trusted relationships like Isaiah was talking about in the very first one, so that they're ready to be safe and trusting relationships to other people around them, which builds the community and so on and so on.
Yeah, for me, there's three things I try to keep in mind doing ministry with members of Gen Z, or just trying to be a dad to my daughter who's in Gen Z. And the three things are this: intimate, substantive, and goodness, the third word went out of my mind. Intimate, substantive, and continued. So intimate meaning like one-on-one, substantive meaning like talking about things that like have actual weight and matter, and being willing to have an opinion and being willing to talk passionately about something. And then lastly, like reliably returning to that relationship and that conversation. So it's something that is continuing over the course of time. It's not just me dropping in, looking them in the eye or texting them directly and saying, hey, here's this important thing that you should care about, but it's something that's ongoing. And so those are three things that I hold to: is intimate, substantive, and continual.
And I think it's interesting to see how that translates to our digital relationships. Because I think of your daughter. I think of all the teenagers I know that they text. That is their form of connecting. And Jon, you're spot on. Like, we are their connection to the church a lot of times. I think back like a couple months ago, I had a parent texting me and saying, hey, my daughter's really struggling right now. Do you think you could reach out and talk to her just about everything she's going through? And I was like, she's been texting me for 3 hours now about this drama going on in her life. And he was like, she's sitting right next to me on the couch. Well, yeah, she's been texting me for the last 3 hours about this. You just maybe didn't realize that. So I think that the education component is part of it too. And Shelly, I like earlier you used the word humility. There is humility in what we are facing right now. I think with Gen Z, they are not always in person. They are not always face to face in the way that maybe we are used to, or the way that we grew up in. And that can be it's a hard thing when you can't quantify if you're reaching people, right? And that's a reality. I think most of us in the youth ministry world, we are really struggling with that. Where do you guys think we are, maybe as a church, where do you think we are maybe missing the mark on understanding Gen Z, reaching Gen Z, connecting with them, giving them opportunities? Are there things that we could maybe think about doing differently?
I think one of the things that I really I'm trying to do moving forward is including Gen Z within the conversation. So many times we try and solve the problem for Gen Z without including them in the conversation. And going back to the previous conversation we were just having, how do we re-engage them? Well, why don't we ask? Why doesn't this group of people sit down with the first session of people and say, how do we re-engage? How do we have meaningful alignment? How do we grow together and grow relationships so that we can re-engage that generation within the church? Because they're going to have the answers. They're the ones walking the walk, walking the roads, as Lee said earlier. We're the ones going to try and meet them where they're at, not them coming to meet us where we're at.
I'm going to add a little bit to that, because I mentioned that we had our class reunions, right? And every class was so different. It was so funny to watch just the uniqueness of each class. But it was really interesting with my juniors, because I think we started the conversation. They were our first one. So we started the conversation maybe a little forward of just saying, hey, this is really what we want to talk about, how to engage. And there was a level of pressure that was brought with that conversation, because it was no secret that they had disconnected from the church over the last year and a half, last 2 years. And so it's interesting because the conversation was somewhat brief, and I was like, okay, I'm not really sure what we got out of this. They're my squirrely class, so I think they know that. So if they watch this, they're not embarrassed. They totally know themselves well enough to know what I mean by that. But one of the boys, when leaving, he left a little bit earlier than the rest, and he kind of said, Pastor Lee, just, I don't know if it's anything that you've done or that you could do. It's really more on us right now too. And so it's just really cool to see him own that piece. But then I think that was a really insightful moment for me too, was like, okay, instead of me asking what can we do, it's how can I walk alongside of students like this who see this and encourage them with different suggestions on things that they can do too, because they might be looking for that and they don't know that they're looking for it too.
And to that, I think to not assuming that they're already gone. I think that happens, especially by the time students get to college. It's like, oh, well, you're in college and you're gone and having this experience and exposed to new things and new ideas, and oh, you've gone with the ways of the world, and whatever our worries are with that. But I think it's our challenge to not be afraid to approach those conversations and the questions or the things that our students are wrestling with. They're exposed to so much. They're dealing with so much. I mean, let's just think for a second as grownups, how much we are dealing with and taking in and trying to cope with. And so then you have young adults or teenagers who are doing some of that. So I think the assumption that, oh, well, this is too hard or we can't. It's like, well, just a little bit at a time to show up, and I don't have to solve your issue. Like, I don't have to fix that for you or give you an answer, but to just be willing to show up with you in that. So I think it's kind of twofold, because yeah, you have to engage students in that. But then it's also like, okay, big brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles in the faith, like this is how we do this too. Like Jon, what you said of, oh man, I can't be the only tether. Like there has to be other tethers, right? And so helping us all to collectively be a little bit more comfortable with those conversations that we're not quite comfortable with. I think that's something where the church gets to grow in a little bit.
And Shelly, I love one of the words you used there. It was about fixing, because that's a big conversation I have with our parents constantly. There's this temptation by the church and by parents and by leaders to fix things for their students. And there's a layer of that works for like elementary school, but once they make that transition in adolescence or moving towards adulthood, it's really not so much about listening. Or the other thing I think that we do is there's a temptation to be right or be correct. And our students feel this. And so it's really interesting. In the same kind of situation with all of the 8th grade in the same gymnasium, kind of gave them the floor to just talk and what advice do you have for the church and things like that. And there was one student in particular that was very adamant about how much adults need to know how to say the words, I don't know. I think it's true for Christians across the board too, as we go out into this world, as people wrestle with questions, there's a certain layer of, we're limited. We don't have the full knowledge of God, we're in his image, but we're just a reflection of that. And being able to admit when you don't know something and be honest about it, to be vulnerable in that moment and not just jump to a right answer or something like that. And again, I think we do that from a place of fear because we're so worried about the context of this world and the evils of this world and the things that our students are facing on a daily basis, that there's this temptation to give them everything they possibly need. We think that's an answer. And we think that's some piece of advice when they really just need someone to listen, to care, to reflect, and to love them with the words that they have for them, and to recognize they're still loved despite whatever it is that they're saying too.
Yeah, so what do you guys think? Where does Gen Z really need us to speak up and speak truth and speak encouragement? What do they need to hear most from our older generations?
I was thinking about this question, you know, as I was looking through what we were going to be talking about today. And I know a lot of my kids, as I interact with them, they need someone who's kind of the church has this obligation almost to be kind of this moral absolute, right? There's not really gray areas when it comes to our faith, right? I mean, there's some, but like you said, Cassie, the gospel will always be the gospel. And in this world where you can hear any opinion you want and anyone can be right on any subject, there's a time for the church to stand up and say, no, this is Christ. He's here for you. He loves you no matter what, right? Like you said, Lee, they don't want to hear they don't want your right answer. What they need to hear is, no matter what decision you've made, Jesus is still there loving you, right? And I would hope that each of us would also be there loving them as well, because ultimately I think that's what they need, that one-on-one relationship. Someone in the very first session I don't remember whose name it was, so I apologize for that, was talking about how when they talk to someone older, they don't want them to give their opinion on what the answer is because they've already made up their mind. They just want to talk to you about it. So for us to be humble enough, as Shelly said earlier, I believe, to just hold our tongues and listen, right? And then when the opportunity presents itself, to say, you know, Jesus loves you, or to call out sin when there is sin there, right? You know, we have that obligation as well, obviously doing that in love towards them, but letting them know what's also wrong, and then the good news of the gospel.
Eric, I went to the same place when I was reflecting on that question, and that was the gospel, you know, being very, very abundantly clear about what the good news about Jesus Christ is. And our group at Trinity is preparing to do a parent podcast. I called it the Parent Book Club podcast, but apparently that wasn't a great name, whatever. We're walking through books that talk about raising kids in the faith. And so we're calling it Raise Them Up for the launch in January, but we're walking through sticky faith. And like, I'm new to the sticky faith reality with my training. I didn't come across that book until I was in the ministry, and they talk about the sticky gospel and just the reality that so many Christians, but especially our younger generations, are missing. They think that somehow the gospel of Jesus Christ is that he came into this world to take people from being bad people and making them good people. And I like to kind of point out that's foreign. When you look at the words of Jesus, it's not about bad to good, it's about death to life. And that communicates. And why does it communicate? Not because any of us, but because that's the reality of the gospel, is that it's taken us out of death and into life. And we're going to mess up and we're going to make mistakes. And the more that we can not just speak that truth, but model that truth for our students, especially as parents, to model that life's not always perfect, and to model that I'm not always perfect, I make mistakes, and to be able to just ask those basic questions about, hey, what's going well in your world today? What's not going so well? Where did you make a mistake today? Like, and to be able to model that and share with this generation, that's what they need. They need to see someone that's actually modeling that life doesn't have to be perfect, and that Jesus does have an answer for the sufferings and the problems and everything that we're going to face in this world. And it's not our good behavior. It's his sacrifice on the cross that brings that resurrection reality for us.
Yeah, this flows from Lee and Eric's point about the centrality of the gospel. But what I would say is Gen Z needs to hear a strong word about identity. What makes you who you are? Because so much of what they're hearing, what they're wrestling with, are ultimately identity questions. I mean, even so much of what's going on with, you know, sexuality and gender, which is a massive conversation right now, is ultimately a conversation about identity. What makes us who we are? And the power of the gospel is that it answers, among other things, that question of what makes you who you are. It's the finished work of Christ given to you that makes you who you are, and how that needs to be central, and the freedom and the peace and the joy that brings to you. There is so much that's going on surrounding the questions of what makes me who I am. And we have an answer to that. We have the answer to that, and built upon a foundation of substantive, intimate, continual conversations, speaking a very clear word of this is what makes you who you are, what has been given to you and done for you in Jesus Christ, and not being afraid to speak as passionately and boldly and definitively about that as everybody else is about all the other things. Yes, we do so with a posture of openness and listening. So this is we assert these things built upon a foundation of care that we've established by being willing to listen and being consistent in these conversations. But ultimately, a strong word about what is it that makes you who you are. This is what makes you who you are, and everything else flows from that and is built upon that.
And
Yeah, Matt.
I was just going to affirm what you said, Matt, about the continuity of that conversation, right? Like that doesn't all happen in one half hour over coffee chat. This is over time, and that you get to come back to it and mull over it and let the Holy Spirit do what the Holy Spirit does. And that I'm still going to show up tomorrow and have this next conversation with you. And walking with you through that. That's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I go to like my relationship with my 16-year-old daughter. She's right in the heart of Gen Z land, right? And my constant conversation with her, the through line of the conversation is one in which I ask her, who are you? And she's like, I know who I am. Who are you? And she's like, I'm a baptized child of God. I'm like, that's right. That's right. You're a baptized child of God. Every day of her life, since the day that she was born, every night when I put her to sleep, and she's going to kill me if she knows I was sharing this on this webcast. But when she goes to bed, I make the sign of the cross on her forehead, and I say, "You are a baptized child of God." And she makes the sign of the cross on my forehead, and she says, "You are a baptized child of God," because ultimately, who I am is the foundation of the life that I live. And that's the question I find every human being is wrestling with. But Gen Z is living in a world that has deconstructed any kind of mooring or foundation we used to have culturally about identity, Christian or not. They've deconstructed all of it. And so now you take that common human wrestling with identity and you couple it with a culture where any kind of certainty around identity is being deconstructed and questioned. Young people now, more than any other generation, I think you could argue, need to know that there is a firm, clear, solid answer about who you are and whose you are. And they need to hear that. They need to hear that from the people around them who have it.
And I think being able to back that up with proof is tremendously helpful. So one of the things that I've noticed with our Gen Z kids is that we've gotten into who is Jesus? We've gotten into the apologetics realm of being able to defend my faith. Why do I believe what I believe? Who am I? How do I know that that is true? And being able to talk about that, it has opened the questions up to questions that we would never have heard back from them. Wait a minute. Well, I didn't realize Jesus probably looked like a Middle Eastern man and wasn't necessarily white. Kind of just things that maybe we as church professionals take for granted, but being able to help them, equip them, and help them to understand that identity and where it comes from and how we can know it's true is just tremendously important and opens the door for continued meaning making, continued conversation, and even more growth as well.
I think it's a critical point for us to really drive home. We have to say these things. It's not something we can think that they take for granted. We have to say this out loud. Actually, it makes me think I had a 10-year-old in my office a couple days ago, just getting some counseling, just kind of going through some tough stuff. And at one point I said, you're forgiven. And she just kind of stopped and looked at me and is like, you're still a child of Jesus. You're forgiven. And just the way her body language changed, just hearing that, I think we have to keep that in mind, that our students, our young people, they need us to say it out loud. They need the reminder. We need the reminder for each other.
Yeah. Cassie, I want to just underscore that point so much, because that's true for all time, right? The gospel needs to be proclaimed. The gospel assumed is the gospel not preached, right? And so it needs to be proclaimed, but how much more so to this world where all the understanding of who I am is deconstructed and where there's all these competing voices. And so when I have anybody of any age, but in particular someone of a young age for whom there's a lack of certainty, and they come into my office and say we go through confession absolution in some way, shape, or form. They confess something and I'm like, you are forgiven. You are forgiven. I tell them explicitly. One practice I'll have them do is I'll say, now ask me about that thing. Ask me about the bad decision. This is after we've done confession and absolution. They'll say, Pastor Matt, I'll make them say this. Pastor Matt, what about the thing I did with my boyfriend? And I'll look right at them and I'll say, what thing? What thing? I don't know what you're talking about. We've just gone through confession and absolution. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I want them to experience the fact that things are different now because they've heard the gospel and they've been forgiven. But I think you have to get that, personally, I think you have to get that explicit with people. Let them experience the reality of the forgiveness of sins that is theirs through Jesus Christ. And again, in a world where there's so many competing voices and where there's a high value on personal connection and intimacy, that's like the only valid currency we have anymore. If you have the opportunity to proclaim and help them experience the reality of being a forgiven child of God, you have to take it. Have to take it.
And just to bring this home, my first year here, I got the opportunity to speak at the chapel over at Concordia in Tomball. And I remember looking at my group of student leaders and I was like, hey, a lot of you guys go to Concordia. What should I talk about? And they said, well, whatever you do, don't do the same thing we always talk about. And I said, well, what's that? And in unison, our identity is based in Jesus Christ alone, because that was like the thing. Like, you got to give it teeth, you got to give it depth. It can't just be saying that statement, but unpacking it. I'm reminded of, well, I think there are a few things, like particularly us in the LCMS, like we take for granted something that's not just Lutheran, but like wholeheartedly Christian. And that is that peace, the grace of God, the forgiveness of sins. And like, just again, I feel like I'm the broken record here talking about this, but my home pastor that I'd grown up with, David Brighton, he told us one time, he was talking to me while I was in seminary about a situation where I grew up in the middle of Georgia. Okay, so you're lucky if you find someone that knows what a Lutheran is in the middle of Georgia. We're that kind of like strung together because our circuits were like 2 hours across and things like that. And he was telling me how he was kind of blown away. There was this immigrant group in Warner Robins surrounded by all these enormous other churches, other denominations. And they visited a whole lot of different ones, and they landed in at Mount Calvary in Warner Robins. And he finally asked them, he said, look, you have all these other churches with so many wonderful bells and whistles and things like, why did you come with us? And the leader of this group kind of looked at him and said, you were the only place that we heard we were forgiven. And it just blew my mind, because it was one of those things, that reality of that thing that we do kind of routinely of confession as a corporate body, and then that forgiveness. I mean, that speaks volumes to people. And I think that's so true with Gen Z too. Imagine, right? The pressure that we know is true, the pressure that we've heard of how much they think they have to be perfect, how much they think that they can't make a mistake. That it's like, actually, let's talk about those as loudly as we can so that everybody knows we're not perfect. I know advice that was given to me along the way when it comes to preaching or teaching and telling a story. Make sure when you tell a story about yourself, you never look good, just to be able to model that kind of mistake for people. Because I really do think, in this Instagram filter world, these kids are just constantly thinking, I have to be perfect. I can't make a mistake. I need to take this post down. I can't message that. I hope that deletes. This is why I use Snapchat. Like everything, they need to be able to proclaim loudly, I'm not perfect, but I trust in the one who is.
Yeah, I love to tell my kids and the parents that I interact with and our parishioners, if you can't learn grace in the church, where are you going to learn it? Because it's very unlikely that you're going to learn it out in society. Because they're performance driven, they're busy driven, they're driven to succeed, to achieve, and to have that unrealistic standard of what is expected and anticipated from us. So if we the church are bad at teaching grace, where are they going to get it?
Yeah, and just consider just the landscape in which we all live, but in particular they're growing up in. It is an incredibly self-righteous, moralistic, and pietistic time. People like to point the finger at the church at being self-righteous and moralistic, but there is nothing quite as self-righteous as kind of a hyper progressive culture, right? The level of certainty in its morality and the level of empowerment it feels to level judgment on others is really unparalleled. And that's what drives a whole lot of the fear about, I gotta be right. Look at the consequences culturally of being wrong. And so we have the opportunity to create a space where we are the community offering them the freedom to admit, you're wrong on a lot of things. And so am I. And we worship a God who loves wrong people, because here's what nobody else will tell you. It's the only kind of people that exist. And we have that. We have that. And you contrast that to this hyper religious, pietistic, self-righteous world that we live in. And oh my goodness, it should be like this water to a dry and dying soul. That's what everybody needs. But in particular, like, imagine being 18 and looking at the same news cycle and the same cancel cycle. Like it's just, who wants to grow up and be an accountable adult in that world? I don't blame them if they want to disengage with that.
No, and I think you guys make so many great points. What do you think is the most important thing we can do to encourage this generation? We're kind of wrapping up here. We want to really land on some practical things that we can do. We're adults that care. We want to be there. We want to speak truth. We want to speak into this perfection culture. We want to have relationships. What are some ways that we can just really dive in and speak into the lives of our young people?
My biggest piece of advice is ask questions. So my students kind of get tired of, and my parents probably too at this point, of how often I bring this up, but I'm far more interested in their questions and what's in their heads than I am in what's in my brain. And so you look at the scriptures too. I remember I was doing a devotion this morning in our religion class, and it was there, Jesus, the young ruler, comes to him and says, "Good teacher." And what is the first thing Jesus does? He asks a question. Why do you call me good? Jesus is a master of asking incredible questions. And I think there's something we can learn from that. He has all the truth in the world. And he kind of is patient with that and sharing that. And it does it over the life of 3 years of ministry, So I think there's a level of patience that we can learn, but especially asking questions, even the simple ones, like, what do you like to do for fun? Tell me about you, like getting to know that. And then, well, what do you think about Jesus? Like, where do you think God's doing? What do you think God has to say about that? Just a question, rather than trying to just assert truth or have to be the truth person. Take that pressure off of your shoulders. And just learn from them and learn with them as you do it too, by asking questions.
Yeah, questions are for sure the fastest way to get anybody who's young, especially, to open up. I feel like I could crack open any middle schooler at all just by asking, 5 minutes of questions, and they will share anything that is on their hearts. And that again, that importance of that relationship, and actually caring and making eye contact and being there, answering the text messages when they come in. It's important.
I was just going to say, we have to like them, right? Like to actually like you. And I want to encourage you that I love what you were saying before, Matt, about reminding people of who we are. My teammate and I talk about that all the time. This is why we are on campus, is to remind people of who they are. But that first comes with like, I think you're super cool and I want to know what makes you tick, and I'm sure you're a little weird, because we all are. And so this permission of like, why would I be interested in being a part of this community or in whatever this Jesus stuff is, like, just start by like liking who God created, this really creative and thoughtful generation, who are really crowd focused, but also like terribly specifically unique and wanting to make sure that we all know that. But yeah, I think the first step of just like, can I just sit and enjoy you? And that my first, I guess what I'm trying to say is our first approach isn't an eye roll or a shocked face. But it's like, oh, cool, you're this person that God put together and I want to learn about you.
I think one of the things that one of the Gen Zers in the first session mentioned was genuine interest, right? And it's that genuine interest because many people, most of us maybe, but Gen Z specifically, they can see through the charade if you're really not interested. If you're just doing it to have the conversation, they get it. They'll shut the door really quickly and just give you, I like pizza. My favorite color is blue. This is wonderful, right? They'll close off. But if you're genuinely interested, and that goes for anybody who works with anybody, but specifically Gen Z, if you're genuinely interested in that person, what they have to say, and you're willing to actually sit and listen and comprehend and have a meaningful discussion, that's just going to go so far, because it goes back to what Lee was saying and Matt was saying and Eric was saying. It doesn't necessarily come down to being right. It comes down to just genuinely having a conversation and saying, well, why do you think that? Well, here's your perspective. Well, are you willing to listen and hear my perspective? Let's talk about how those things are different. Let's talk about how those things are the same. And being genuinely invested in people, and in this context, specifically the Gen Zers.
Yeah, there's a theme emerging, and I'll give you two words. Number one is curiosity, just genuine curiosity about the people you're serving, especially in this age group. Don't let go of curiosity. Don't assume you know things, and just be genuinely curious about who they are, what they care about, what drives them, what motivates them. And then the other thing would be not in relating to this generation, specific generation, but relating to others on behalf of this generation would just be advocacy. And what I mean by that is, so often when we talk about this generation or other generations and we use these monikers, millennial, Gen Z and things, we highlight all the negative things. We highlight how much they're on their phones. We highlight their mental health struggles. That's all we talk about. And like, I think we need to be one who is speaking primarily positive things about the younger generation, because we're handing the keys to this car over to them. And we need them to know that we believe in them and we love them and that we see the good. God knows exactly who they are, and he is not at all hesitant to hand the church over to this generation. And so we need to speak a positive word about them to others and let them know whatever positive things we see, we need to let that be the first word that we speak. And then that's going to resonate in the hearts of the young people that we serve. They're going to see us going, man, when you got up in front of my parents, you talked only about how awesome this generation is. I know you see the potential and the possibility and the image of God in me. I know you see that. And so I love you for that, and I trust you for that.
Yeah, and I think, as we've all pointed out, it doesn't matter what generation we're talking about. We're really in a ministry of relationships, right? So anyone that's going to work with this generation or any other generation has to be willing to invest the time and be there, like you said, Cassie, to answer the text message, even when it comes in at 11:30 at night and I'm like hearing it go off and I'm like, oh man, I better answer that. You have to be there and you have to be present when they're ready to talk. And to kind of take what Matt said as well, we're handing the keys over to them. And we've talked at length about this, Cassie and John. It's our responsibility to also identify leaders as we see them and let the Gen Z kids know, hey, I think you're talented at this. I think you'd be good at being a DCE or a pastor or a deaconess or whatever it is, because at some point, this generation is going to be the one leading our church. And as Matt says, we always need to talk about them in positive light, and any generation for that matter in a positive light, but really be intentional about identifying what traits we think are good within these kids and how that can relate to the ministry as well. because someone's going to have to carry this ministry that we're so passionate about on after we're unable to do it anymore.
Yeah, I'll definitely echo that, Eric. One of my other roles, it's a new role for me. I'm part of the recruitment department at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis as one of the new seminary recruitment advocates. And we got that letter back in the spring from Thomas Egger, the new president of seminary, talking about the future of pastors in Synod and seeing that we have, I believe it was over 480 vacancies right now in the LCMS, and over 55% of our current pastors are 50 years of age or older or something like that, some sort of incredible thing that in 10 years, I mean, this generation and plenty in the generations above that too, but this generation is going to be those filling that gap, and we can start now. And so to any leaders of churches or within churches, whether that's professional or lay leadership, the conversation starts now of seeing it, and just talk to people that work for churches. Every single one of us has a very unique path that God took us on to whatever role. I like to say I went kicking and screaming into the pulpit, and I still do, right? And so God used his church as he promised to do, and he's still doing the same thing today. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking a young student. I knew by the time I was 14, I knew what God was calling me to do. I fought it. But I was 14 years old when I knew, oh, you want me to be a pastor? Really? Okay. And so just asking the question to someone, have you ever considered being a pastor? Have you ever considered being a DCE? Have you ever considered full-time church work? Like that's as easy as it gets. And then they could say, no, I've never considered that. Why did you say that? What an opportunity for you to then speak that truth into it, right? So we have a cool opportunity as the church today. And I love this conversation of handing over the keys. I'm also in a growing young cohort with Fuller Youth Institute right now, and we just did the key chain leadership. And it's not just handing over the keys when we leave. It's handing over the keys right now. Because that was my story of leaders that were willing to hand over the keys to me when I was 15 years old to lead a devotion or to lead a talk in worship or lead a small group or something like that. And that's the kind of opportunities we have right now. I don't think we need to be afraid that someone's going to replace us one day. I think that's a joy to know that and to be able to hand that kind of stuff over even right now.
You guys have so much wisdom to share. And I have to say, I'm just struck with just a sense of gratitude that you are each serving in the way that you are leaders that care about young people, that are invested in the next generation, that you are speaking up and advocating for them. So I thank you guys for doing that. That is an important role. As we close here, I want to do rapid fire and hear from everybody. What is one short prayer that you have for Gen Z? What is something that we can be praying together as the collective church, the community of believers? What is a prayer that you have for this generation?
My prayer for the generation is that they see a successful life lived out in their faith in Christ. That their success comes from their identity in Christ, and that the success that comes, whether in the business world, in the church world, whatever, is second to that, because our success is based in Christ's death and resurrection on the cross, and we can count that as a big old check mark, not done for us, and that any of the other success we can give glory to God for that, and just have that as our foundational identity as we go into the workforce and continue with all the things that we do.
My prayer for this generation is that they understand that God made them exactly the way that he meant for them to be, right? In this world of Instagram filters and things like that, right? God made you the way you are for a purpose. He knows his plans for you. He will use your unique gifts and abilities. And I just want them to understand that they don't have to be like everybody else. God made them to be them, and that's perfectly fine.
I'll borrow the words of a book I'm reading by CPH right now with Ted Daring, and just that they would trust, seek, and follow Jesus, of all the voices that they're hearing. I tell kids all the time, please, listen to what everybody else is saying, but return to this too, because it's always the word of God is always going to stand in the end. It gets challenged. It's been challenged for centuries, and it's going to stand. Just trust God, seek him, and follow him with all that you got. And that's my prayer, is that God would just continue to strengthen them and surround them with people that help model for them what that looks like.
I think my prayer is that this generation would know that they're an important and valued part of God's family, that God has put them at this moment, at this time, for such a time as this, to be a cultural translator in ways that you and I are they're more equipped to do that, to speak to their peers, and so that they would be grown in the truth to be translators outwardly in that too.
You know, my prayer for our young people in our ministry, and for my own kids, is that God would keep their hearts anchored in Jesus and their hearts soft for others, that they would not grow cold in their compassion for others, because that's a really, really unique aspect of young people today, and that He would keep their hearts anchored in a knowledge that they are completely and fully loved in Jesus Christ.
And one of the really special things that I get to see in my job working with young people is just how many people have even been watching this webinar series. I have gotten text messages from tons of young people, college students, teenagers, middle schoolers. I know there are classes of middle schoolers watching this right now in the Midwest. So to you guys, we want to say we love you. You know, we are here for you. We care about you. You matter to us. And that's why we are here having these discussions. You are loved by the Creator and loved by us too. So we thank you guys for your incredible insight. You guys are just a deep group, and I love chatting with you. Just a reminder again, if you missed any of the other webinars, they are at cph.org/Gen Z. There's also a great guide there, just a resource guide for you to take and have discussions in your own community, have a little list of prayer items that you can pray for Gen Z. But we love doing this series because we know that it matters. These are important conversations to have. So I want to say a special thank you to the team at Concordia Publishing House, Stephanie and Anna and Elizabeth and Nora. You guys just did a great job on this series. So thank you. This actually, from the get-go, has involved Gen Z participants. So Nora she's actually a CPH intern. She did all of the graphic design and all the marketing and social media stuff for this. So thank you for that. We're glad that you are involved in this process. But thank you guys for being here. Thank you for following along with this series, and God bless.